Hirsch on the year. So we're going to learn about Hanukkah because we're just 2 weeks away from Hanukkah now, or less. I think that we'll put Horeb aside for these 2 weeks, and we'll see what Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch has to tell us about Hanukkah. The miracle of Hanukkah and its impact on the nation. Oops, I'm reading it different. We'll read that one next week. Okay. Hanukkah, consecration and inspiration in Judaism. One of the qualities of Rabbi Hirsch is that he's very focused on the symbolic significance of different things in Yiddishkeit. Very often he'll go to great details to explain, or great effort to explain, relatively small details in terms of their unique symbolism to Judaism. Although I haven't finished reading this whole thing, I suspect he's going to get into that. Hanukkah is filled with it. I mean, obviously light, and we have to keep in the back of our mind, Hanukkah really divides into two extremely different understandings of the holiday. On one side there's this momentous, miraculous military victory. It's unbelievable. It's the remains of Alexander's empire, the Seleucids. Half of the empire is defeated by what was never more than 2,500 fighters, right? And people who began with not a lot of fighting skills. They were Kohanim. The Maccabees or Hashmonaim were a family of Kohanim. So they knew something about knives because the temple service involved knives, but they weren't a warrior class at all. And somehow they had tremendous success against this superpower of its time. So that is one miracle that is without question. I think I mentioned this before, is that there still is, a statue of Yehuda Maccabee at West Point, the U.S. Army training school for officers. It has a long tradition dating back to, I think, as far as back as Washington. And they have a statue of Yehuda Maccabee there because they view him as the founder of guerrilla warfare, way before Che Guevara. Although I read an article about 4 or 5 years ago about one of the instructors who used to teach the Jewish wars, the wars that the Maccabees fought against the Syrian Greeks, and he stopped teaching it. He didn't want to teach it anymore. He was a devout Christian, and he realized, as a colonel, as a frontline colonel, he said, the tactics of Yehuda Maccabee are remarkable, and there is what to learn from that. But if I sent our soldiers out to follow these tactics, right, without miraculous intervention, I would be sending them to their death. So, I'm not sure that this is an appropriate thing for me to be teaching, because if you take God out of the equation of this military victory, the tactics alone probably would not have worked. That was his point. So on one side you have that, and there's very little mention of that in our literature. There were 2 books, Maccabees 1 and Maccabees 2, that didn't make it into Tanakh. They're part of what's called the Apocrypha today. They're books that were not considered to be part of the sacred text, which divides into the Torah. Tanakh stands for Torah, Nevi'im, Kesuvim. Torah, the prophets, and the writings. The writings involve the Megillahs, Psalms, Koheles, a number of things, but doesn't involve the Maccabees. It was written in a similar time. But the history of the wars is in the book of the Maccabees, and it's not part of our canon. What is part of our belief is or part of our acknowledgement and remembrance of Hanukkah is the lighting of the menorah, the miracle of the oil, which one could argue is not that big of a miracle. Why? Because, for instance, the westernmost lamp in the menorah in the temple never went out. Even though the other lights all went out, this one continued to light, and it didn't have more oil than the others. So it was like an ongoing miracle of a light that didn't go out. Right? So what was that about? Right? Why is this one? More than that, there are stories in the Gemara. There's a very famous story of, I think it's Rabbi Hanina ben Doza, that I think it was his daughter, came to him. He was not a wealthy man, and said, Father, it's Shabbos and we're out of oil. What are we going to do about the lichvention, about lighting candles for Shabbos? Right? And he said, well, use vinegar. She said, what? He said, use vinegar. Right? He who made it possible for oil to burn can make it possible for vinegar to burn. Use vinegar. She did, and it burnt. Right? Now, I'm not sure that if I tried to light vinegar it would work. Right? But the voice came from heaven and said that it's because of my beloved Hanina ben Doza that the world rests on him. That he was a very remarkable person. And my point is that the miracle of oil burning, uniquely burning beyond its time, is not the biggest miracle in the world at all. And we see other cases of it that don't have huge celebration around them. More than that, they didn't have to wait for purified oil. If the nation itself was not pure, more than 50% of it, then the issue of the oil was not an issue, and certainly the nation was not at that time. So they could have used impure oil if they wanted to. They didn't want to. They wanted to do it the best way they could. But it's a curious thing what a small role the military victory plays in our memories, and what a big role the oil plays. And we can examine that a little bit more as we go forward. Let's see what Rav Hirsch says. Hanukkah. The very word brings to mind the dawn of morning, the glimmer of springtime. The very thought bespeaks the light of the morning and the breath of spring. Hanukkah, boyhood and early youth, the one great Hanukkah during which the buds of the mind and the spirit open, during which the innermost sanctuary of the soul is to be won for the holiest of holies, and the boy awakening to manhood is to be armed and consecrated. Hanukkah is to consecrate, to activate the values that should accompany him through life in manhood and in old age. Hanukkah may be the exalted, uplifting moment when a man has accomplished a task that should signify for him not the end, but the beginning of a future, filled with hope and with joy of living. Hanukkah thus speaks the narrow wisdom of mortals. Hanukkah, youth and consecration come only once in a lifetime. If you have trifled away your youth, it is lost beyond recall. If you have lost your consecration, you have forfeited it forever. Rav Shochet often likes to say that the fact that the first mitzvah that's given to the nation is Rosh Chodesh is a powerful symbol, because we know that with tremendously wealthy people, almost all of them at one time or another were bankrupt and came back and made their millions, sometimes bankrupt 3 or 4 times, and stayed at it, and they took great risks, and eventually they made their fortune, right? So it meant that they could lose a lot of money and end up being very wealthy. But the loss of time is irreplaceable. When you lose time, there's no way to get it back. It's gone. Right? And so the idea that Rosh Chodesh is to be determined by the people is an idea that says the value, and that it's our first mitzvah. Even before, go and, have children, comes Rosh Chodesh. It's the first mitzvah given to the nation. It's to tell us the value of time and the preciousness, because it is so fleeting. So he says, If you have trifled away your youth, it is lost beyond recall. If you have lost your consecration, you have forfeited it forever. There are only certain periods in his life when man is capable of enthusiasm for great things, when he is receptive to consecration. The feelings of a child, the passion of youth, the romance of betrothal, the spirit of consecration, all these are poetic moments bestowed by a merciful Father upon the hapless hearts of men to comfort them, to cover at least their beginnings with the rosy sheen of hope, and to cheer the end with the sweet sorrow of nostalgic memories. Reality has none of the pearly dew that glistens in the morning sun. The seeds of fantasy must be crushed before reality can develop. A man who would wish to preserve childlike emotion and youthful passion in his heart is but a poor fool. A woman who looks for the fulfillment of her bridal dreams amidst the cares of her household and family life will end with a broken heart. Home and synagogue alike become irrelevant to real life if the contents of the odes recited at their consecration should be taken as anything but mere poetry. I wonder where he's going with this. And yet, and yet Hanukkah comes again and again in the calendar of our years. And this calendar is very much in earnest about having Hanukkah bring, Hanukkah, new consecration, new strength. When someone moves into a new home, right, they have a Hanukkah habayis, right? It's a consecration of the home. The word Hanukkah has a number of different derivations, but one of them is to consecrate, because they reconsecrated the temple after they purified it, right? So that's how the holiday got its name. So he's dealing with this word, Hanukkah. The new consecration, new strength, and a new vigorous beginning to life, both in the synagogue and in the family, in every age. The story of Hanukkah itself gives the lie to the illusion that dismisses poetry of life as vapid fiction. The zeal of Hanukkah caught fire within the breast of an old man of 80, and this flame was to inspire a whole nation to fight for the preservation of truth, the consecration of the holiness and the sanctification of its life. The nation became capable of sufficient enthusiasm to risk its life with all its treasures for the greatest values in national survival could afford. Indeed, it was this enthusiasm that marked the beginning of Hanukkah, of the nation's historic maturity and old age. And then you would consider the inspiration and the consecration of Hanukkah a fiction and a lie, if only to amuse children and to excite young men until they both wake up and to the sober realities of life. Why do you equate inspiration with consecration, with the flowers which you arrange to adorn your so-called consecration ceremonies, but which do not live until the next day? Faded blossoms, like the wilted wreaths of yesterday's temple services, confirmations or weddings, they perch their own message, sic transit, could end, implying that all the sentiments and emotions, the high ideals and resolves which you praised as eternal at your consecration ceremonies are things of the past. Why indeed? Because your inspiration and your consecration have been a lie from the very beginning. You want to inspire, but you have no object to which to direct that inspiration. You want to consecrate, but somehow you have misplaced the life for which you should consecrate yourselves and others. You do not inspire the child to assume the duties of youth. You do not inspire the youth to assume the duties of mature men and women. You do not inspire the mature man and woman to assume the duties of old age. You do not inspire the old to prepare for the eternal life in this world and the world to come. You do not comprehend the concept of the train the child to go his own individuality in the way in which he should go. It's from Proverbs, the idea of to train a child to go in the right way. That is to say, there's, one child will learn through incentive, one child will learn through discipline, one child will learn through humor, one child will learn through history. You have to find the path to teach a child the life's lessons. And they're different, they can be different for each child. Your consecration is always a climax which can only be followed by a decline, when in fact it should be a beginning, leading to a steady ascent onward and upward. Your inspiration and your consecration lack a core of sustenance, that they have no object to accept themselves. One of the tragedies about bar mitzvahs is, for some children, bar mitzvahs become the beginning, really, of a level of maturity and a kind of level of learning that they haven't achieved before. You'll very often see it in a boy, that he goes through a change which is not simply the change of puberty. It's because it happens too fast. It happens right after his bar mitzvah, within 2 weeks. He develops a kind of persona that's less frivolous, that's more earnest. Not that he doesn't have fun. Adults have fun too. But that he's examining how he moves forward, the consequence of his actions, much more. And then other boys view the bar mitzvah as the end of their learning. They had to work very hard to get to their bar mitzvah. They're going to one school, and then they're going to Hebrew school at night, and Sunday school, and they're learning to read their Haftorah and their Maftir, and all. They have to take a test from the Rabbi. Do they understand what they're doing, right? And they yearn for this day of the bar mitzvah, because then they're finished with it. No more night school, no more Sunday school. I'm done with it. It's finished, right? So the question is, how do these ceremonies affect all of us, right? Do we view Hanukkah as something that comes and goes, or do we view it as a starting point for growth and consecration? That's what Hirsch is asking here. Your inspiration and your consecration lack a core of sustenance. They have no object except themselves. You regard inspiration and consecration as goals in themselves, and that is why they fizzle out, leaving you behind in the darkness of night, like a rocket that has run out of fuel. It's amazing. He wrote these words in the 1850s. A rocket that has run out of fuel. Your love for your bride was only flirtation. Your love for your children exhausted itself in caresses, and your interest in your temples ended with the glitter and the pomp of your consecration ceremonies. You never placed truth at the beginning, and that is why you have lies and deception everywhere. How different is the Jewish inspiration and consecration? How different the Jewish Hanukkah, wherever and whenever it comes. Hanukkah. The Jewish Hanukkah does not feed the child with fairy tales. It does not beguile childhood with youth and youth with notions of a world that does not exist. It does not seek to win their hearts or minds for a life which reality will never afford them. The Hanukkah of Judaism guides youth directly to the law, to the same realities and the same truths that should be the guides and the goals of all his future life. So, we know that there's another holiday that comes at the same time of the year. Right? And that holiday is filled with, myths of Father Christmas and Santa Claus and all kinds of, and everybody knows Santa Claus doesn't exist. Right? Sorry, if you're watching this, there's no Santa Claus. Right? Only some guy hired you. Rabbi Feigelbaum told a great story that every year at Purim time, at Sukkot, his kids wanted to buy decorations for the Sukkah, right? And some of the very popular decorations for Sukkah in Israel are made for decorating other things during the year, but it's sold at Purim, right? So for decorating trees at Christmas time, things like that, right? So every year the kids were really interested in this big round chassid that wore a red outfit with a black belt and had a long white beard, right? They're very frum people, right? And and Rabbi Feigenbaum had a job, right? And that was that he would take his whole family, as a big family, right? And they would go shopping for Sukkot decorations while his wife prepared the house and the meal for the first night of Sukkot. She basically wanted everybody out of the way so she could get her work done, right? So he had this task every year of going to the store in Israel to buy some decoration, right? But it was really just to get them out of the way so his wife could get her work done. And every year they would drive him crazy because they always wanted a decoration of this, chassid dressed in red with the black belt. And he knew exactly what it was, and he said, it's not going to be in my sukkah, right? Emphatically not, right? Finally, one year, he couldn't stand the pressure anymore, and he bought it, right? And when his wife saw it, she was very disconcerted. She said, how could you do that? He said, I'm under tremendous pressure every year. You're here making the food, right? I'm with all these kids, and they're driving me crazy. Every year it's the same thing, over and over. I thought I broke down, right? And so we'll put it in the sukkah, big deal, it's a big chassid. So, but he tried to explain to the kids that it was really inappropriate. The next year, in December, right, they found themselves in New York. Right? So on every corner on New York, right, there's one of these guys with a bell, right, ringing a bell, right, for Salvation Army, right. It's a big time of year for collecting charity for the Salvation Army. And so they have the Sally Ann is on, in Midtown Manhattan. It's literally every corner. Right? So he's explaining to his kids, he's saying, look, it's nice the Gentiles are collecting charity, that's a good thing. They're going to help each other, it's very good. And they use this technique of this thing, but you have to know it's not part of our world. It's absolutely not Jewish, right? And we don't have anything to do with it. At which point a Santa Claus turns to him and says, Shalom Aleichem, Rabbi. It was an Israeli guy who got hired, by the Salvation. They just hire people to do this. It doesn't matter what their faith is, right? They hired this Israeli guy, to dress up as Santa Claus and collect money, right? Turns to Rabbi Feigenbaum and says, Shalom Aleichem, Rabbi.
Another Jewish thing.
So, anyway, Hirsch's point is that what we do at this time of year, our form of consecration, is significantly different. Because, first of all, it's not based on myth. It's based on historical events which are intended to teach us something. Right? So let's see what he says. How different is the Jewish inspiration and consecration? How different the Jewish Hanukkah, wherever and whenever it comes. Hanukkah, the Jewish Hanukkah, does not feed the child with fairy tales. It does not beguile childhood and youth with notions of a world that does not exist. It does not seek to win their hearts and minds for a life which reality will never afford them. Hanukkah of Judaism guides youth directly to the law, to the same realities and truths that should be guides and goals of all his future life. Then he comes back to this phrase, in the way to which he should go, and even when he is old, he will not depart from that way. Right? So if you train him properly, it's a very politically incorrect phrase to use, because we think, training puppies, right? But there's an idea that you train your children. It's not a negative thing, right? And that they will stay on that path if you do your job properly, Mirz Hashem, in their old age, and pass it on. The Hanukkah of Judaism inspires him for God and duty, consecrating him for that ideal from the first dawning of his consciousness. If it has succeeded in thus inspiring him, and if its consecration has been successful, God and duty will be his guiding stars on his path through the rest of his life, to keep on growing in the knowledge of God and of his duty, in the service of God and in the fulfillment of his duty. That is what the child expects to do when he becomes a youth, and a youth expects to do when he becomes a grown man, and a grown man expects to do when he becomes old, and what the old man expects to do throughout his old age. By bequeathing to the next generation the treasures of knowledge and of life that have ripened for him, the old man will be able to reap the values to which he first awoke as a child, and for which he lived throughout his life, with ever-growing inspiration, as his harvest of perfection into the new beginning and the world to come. So he's saying that, the lessons of the holidays of the 25th of December have some positive lessons. They are about peace. They are about charity. They're, unfortunately, they're built on mythology. Even the people practice and understand that this was not the birthday of the individual, that it was chosen for a lot of reasons to be on this day. See what the Jewish people is like as long as it remains truly Jewish. There is none like it in the great wide world. We see the old man poring over the same sources of inspiration and consecration that nourished him when he was a child, a youth in the prime of his manhood. The same book, the same law, the same truth which first kindled the child's spirit and inspiration also nourished the passion of youth, engaged the earnest study of the mature, and illuminate the eyes of the old man. Thus the man of 70 still pores assiduously over his folios and draws inspiration from the same words that he first learned to stammer with shining eyes when he was 5 and 10 years old. One of the natures of Judaism is that there's very little generational separation. Because even though a child may be much more competent to operate an iPod, when it comes to learning Bava Mitzvah, a piece of Talmud, whatever the piece of it is, it's the same piece of Talmud, and it has a great deal to teach both the older and the younger person. So a man of 70 can sit with a boy of 14, and where you wouldn't be able to do this in math, because you've advanced to a much higher level, right? With learning Jewish texts, especially Talmud, there's a commonality between grandfather and grandson, that they can sit over this thing and learn it together. It's basically, and it's explained by some people that one of the things that prevents the dementia of Alzheimer is the use of the mind. That people who use their minds actively in their old age keep a sharpness. That doesn't say there's no chemical predisposition to Alzheimer's or medical things that I'm not going into, but generally speaking, you hear very often from the medical world that the brain is a kind of muscle. If you don't use it, it what's the word for it? Petrifies. It functions less and less effectively. If you do use it, outside the Jewish world, people will suggest, when you're in your 70s, learn a new language. It's not an easy thing to do, but that's the very reason to do it, is because you're stretching the synapses of your mind. You're making it work, and as you make it work, it'll become more effective, right? Well, learning the Talmud is exactly that. And there is an expression, actually, in the Talmud, that an old person who does not learn will be a fool. And an old person who learns can be a wise one. Right? And it predates the physiological and the scientific understanding of it, but I think there's probably, just through observation, it was pretty clear that the differences between the two. If you let your mind be idle, it's you can become less effective. Thus the man of 70 still pores assiduously over his folios and draws inspiration from the same words that first learned to stammer with shining eyes when he was 5 and 10 years old. Look at the marriage of the Jew. It is not gallantry, flirtation, and delusive romance that join the hearts and the hands of Jewish husbands and wives. When a man and wife unite, they do it in full awareness of the sober realities of their married lives, for the purpose of living by these realities. Their love is based on their inspired eagerness to fulfill their duties together, and on the desire of each to enhance the happiness of the other. That is why the longer they are married, the more they will love each other, and the consecration of their lives grows only deeper as they go through life's vicissitudes together. Their wedding is not the pinnacle of their lives. It is only the springtime when their love first begins to grow. Subsequent years only add links to the chain that binds their hearts and their spirits together. The Jewish marriage is a contractual relationship. It's a formal contract. When you read a ketubah, it's a binding contract, and it's viewed that way. And the only way out of it is through a court that will dissolve it. It's not a casual document. And we know that it says that Yitzchak married Rivka and then he loved her. That the love grew over time. There's a Rabbi Raphael told a really interesting story one time, that he had run a seminar with different aged couples, and if you took a young couple who was just married, they'd been married for a year, 2 years, and you took them aside separately and you said, why did you marry Shmuel? Why did you marry Sarah? Right? They would have a long list of the reasons that they got married. He's kind, he's generous, he's polite, he's good with other people, he's a fair man, right? She's a wonderful homemaker, she's kind to me, I see her chesed, she cares for other people, she's a great, I know that she'll be a great mother. The whole list of them, right? 20 years into the marriage, right? Well, he cares for me and he's kind, right? And, she's thoughtful and she, looks after the things that are important to me. 50 years into it, I don't know, I just love her. The reasons, the individual reasons, disappear, they fade, right? And of course this is actually a very healthy thing, because if you love somebody for a specific reason, that can change. But if you can love them for their essence, which you cannot know at the very beginning, you may sense it, but you don't know it, it's something that comes over time, right? Then that will not be interrupted by a change in circumstances, right? The most obvious one, if you marry somebody because she is gorgeous or because he is wealthy, both of those things can change. If it's because he's wealthy, he could fall in bad times, and if he's poor, he could become rich. And if her beauty is the beauty of a pin-up girl, for sure that will change. Baruch Hashem, I have 2 cousins who are in their 80s, right? Mid to late 80s now, right? And he looks at his wife, you can see through his eyes that he's looking at a 20-year-old woman. She was very tall and she's a very beautiful woman, right? And he was a handsome. They still see each other exactly that way, And it's not that their eyes are deceiving them. It's not that at all. Actually, they're seeing what is the truth in each other, and it's very beautiful. So I think that this is a point he's making about the nature. You come into marriage for very concrete reasons, as opposed to the opposite, right? Because very often people get married because they're infatuated with each other. They're not in love with each other at all. They're just excited by each other. I remember when I was first learning about Yiddishkeit, and I was a single person, that Rabbi Mandel gave a class on what the Gemara tells you that people should look for in each other before they decide that this is the right person. And it was a very concrete set of things. I remember a few of them. One of them was, do we have the same global objectives for the world? Right? It's pretty big terms, right? But do we have this hope for the world? That we can have. Another one was, and this is a very interesting one. Do we bring out the best in each other? Somebody looking at us when we're together would say, he's much better when he's with her than when he's on his own, or vice versa. Right? Because sometimes we see people who are very nice and they're very unpleasant when they're together. We've all seen it in couples, where they're decent people, but they're just snapping at each other constantly, and they're unpleasant to each other. Right? Gemara says this is not good. This does not bode well for a marriage if you see this in somebody you're with. Right? Another one is, how do they act with people who give them service? You go to a restaurant. Does the person say, "This bottle of wine stinks, take it back"? Or does he say, "Excuse me, I think the bottle of wine may have gone off. Could you see if you possibly could replace it?" Or show appreciation for the service that you got. If somebody does do that, right, in a positive way, it indicates that they're a caring person. Right? Now, they may be faking it because it's their date. They want to impress you, and they know but at least they know what it should be. But so there's a list. I don't have the whole list off the top of my head, but the Gemara actually has a list. It's like a checklist. This is the things you look for. My wife said to me that when we were courting, she said, David, my wife was born in Odessa. And, it's very simple. I'm an open book. In a language you don't understand. No, I'm an open book. I am what I feel. But in a language you don't understand. Okay. Let's see where we are for time. Okay, we should.
But how was it connected to Hanukkah? Who started it?
Okay, so he was. We'll come back to it now. Okay. So he says, subsequent years, he's talking about marriage, only add links to the chain that binds the hearts and spirits together. He's talking about Jewish marriage. Look at the Jewish temples of the Jewish era. We have no accounts of the Hanukkah accompanied by pomp and pageantry. There was no pealing of organs or choral singings. There were neither wreaths nor consecrations nor odes. For the most part, there was not even any consecration sermons or guest preachers. The scrolls of the law were carried into the synagogue, and the briefest brachas of thanksgiving and blessings for him who is good and beneficent, Tov HaMeitiv, were recited, followed by the first mincha service in the new synagogue. That ended the consecration ceremony of Hanukkah. So it wasn't a big heroes, we beat them, march through the up Broadway. It's very straightforward. We're ready. It's mincha. We can light the menorah. Let's move forward. With our lives. Yeah, to some degree, he's explaining maybe why the miracle of the victory we never played very big. Right? We played the oil very big. It wasn't the focus. However, that civil consecration ceremony, followed by the constant attendance at the synagogue became the community's place of refuge, the place where the congregation prepared itself for everyday life. It was the rallying point of the community's life before God and the center of learning, where all of life's infused with God. Such were the desires and the resolves that motivated the building of synagogues in olden days. The consecration of those synagogues did not end with the last Amen of the consecration sermon, or with the final Hallelujah of the concluding hymn. The Hanukkah was the cradle, the last will and testament of the synagogue's consecration. So it was the beginning of the whole process. The consecration was never seen as a high point. Of course, an un-Jewish era is characterized by more beautiful, more sumptuous consecration services. But the enthusiastic leaders who arranged these exercises are hardly ever seen at the synagogue except perhaps once a year on Yom Kippur. The rest of the year, on the weekdays of everyday life, the halls of the synagogues are closed. Or perhaps like a sick and dying patient, the synagogue boasts a minyan club, or a paid minyan appointed by deputies in an attempt to embody and inspire consecration hymns and sermons during the 9/10ths of the year, when the elegant synagogue is a luxury because no one attends it. Now, we have to keep in mind when Hirsch is living at this point, because he's living in the face of the tremendous vitality and growth of Reform Judaism. And he sees Reform Judaism very much as a hollowed out kind of Judaism. And I come back to one point which I'll make a number of times because it's very hard to understand this, is that Reform Judaism was not intended to be an alternative to Orthodox Judaism. That's to say, today when you fill out a form and they ask you what's your affiliation, you might say Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, unaffiliated. Those are some of the possibilities. Now there's many more, actually. It's like going to a bakery at this point. There's so many choices. But it used to be those were the three: Orthodox, Conservative, Reform. Right? So that was not the intention of the Reform movement. The Reform movement believed strongly, it had one thing in common with Orthodoxy, and that was that there should be one form of Judaism.
To replace?
Yeah. Should be only one form of Judaism. Orthodox Judaism that is reformed and brought up to date with the times. They were not interested in competitive faiths. They said this doesn't work and what we're presenting does work. And so what they did was they began with great success to take over the institutions of Judaism. See, today, where we live, there's a tremendous separation between church and state. Right? So things that are Jewish happen in the synagogue. You know, we have a based in that Orthodox communities go to deal with financial issues and so on. But there was a time when Jewish communities were almost autonomous entities within other governments. And they would have a liaison between the Jewish government of the community and the federal government. So if there was taxes to be collected, the Jewish organization would collect the taxes and pay it to the government. If there was a negotiation about buildings that had to be built or schools that had to be done, whatever it was, right? There would be negotiations almost the way there is between city and province in Canada, or province in the federal government. Right? So what happened was that the Reform movement began to take over these institutions. They didn't create new institutions. The Beis Din became a Reform Beis Din. Right? The school was an Orthodox cheder, it became a Reform cheder. Right? And it just got taken over because the Reform movement grew with tremendous vitality. But there was no intention to have two systems at all, by either side. Right? The response to this in Eastern Europe, and I'm repeating some things we've said before, was very much the Hasidic format. If our fathers did not do it, we will not do it. And this is how we take care of the Reform community. Right? The response in Western Europe was the Litvish, the yeshivish view of it, right? Which was we stay in our study halls and we learn. And the other element was Rav Hirsch, who really stood in the breach of the battle and fought back and said, Judaism has a great deal to offer the modern man. Torah im derech eretz, Torah within the world. And he believes strongly that many of the things that other people might consider forbidden, the Torah and the rabbis don't forbid it. So we don't have to forbid it just because we didn't do it. We forbid it if it's in conflict with Torah values, for sure, it's completely forbidden. But if not, let's analyze it and see, gee, this is something we can use, and it's appropriate, or not. So Hirsch stood in the middle and fought this, I would say from a German Jewish perspective, which was different than the Eastern European Jewish experience. So what he's talking about here, when he's talking about other ways of approaching Judaism, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about the struggle that he's in the middle of at this point. Look at Jewish history. From the very beginning, the nation was shown its mission in world history, in all its glory, but also in all its solemn import, and the heights to which it would have to ascend over the centuries, the millennia of error and sorrow. Israel's inspired yes at the foot of Mount Sinai was not demanded for the acceptance of some illusion, but for the acceptance of the real Jewish life, Jewish destiny, with all the vicissitudes of being Jewish. The Jewish nation knew from the very onset that its mission would lead it through a rocky path, winding upward over cliffs and sudden sharp drops. It knew that it would arrive at the summit of its perfection, implied by an unqualified yes, only in the far distant future, at the time of Mashiach, at the end of days. The Jewish nation is the only nation which has a true Hanukkah, true consecration, for which Hanukkah recurs in every phase of its history, in an ever-growing, ever brighter, ever purer light that guides it towards ever-increasing dedication and constant progress towards its goal. Israel was not to start out like the ancient Hellenists, as a nation filled with enthusiasm for beauty and goodness, only to end pitifully and glorified only by the feeble halo of past splendor. Nor was it to ascend the stage of history like Rome, as a world-conquering nation nurtured by the wolf's milk, living by the sword and devious politics, only to end in misery as a conglomerate of peoples enslaved by priestlings and foreigners. Israel's shame came at the beginning of its history. Its everlasting glory still beckons to it from the high places of the future. I think we'll hold here. He goes on, and it's actually very interesting because I've been also reading this book which I mentioned to you, A Letter in the Scroll by Jonathan Sacks. It's an absolutely wonderful book which actually deals with Israel's place in the world, and why Hirsch's, Rav Sacks' point of view, he's the chief rabbi of the UK, is that until recent years, when you ask somebody why they're Jewish, it was like a foolish question. We've always been Jewish.
Why are you Jewish?
Why are you Jewish? It was like a foolish question. Why are you Jewish? And the simple answer is my mother's Jewish. My family's always been Jewish. Right? Now, there were the very rare exceptions who were converts, who chose to become Jewish for some enlightened reason. But most people were Jewish because they didn't think there was any alternative. That's what I am. Right? Rabbi Sacks points out that in the world we live in today, people don't see it that way. People see everything as a choice. So I can kind of, I was born of a Jewish mother, but, don't hold that against me. I can be anything I want. I can convert, be anything I want, right? So then Sacks says, I want to give you the reasons why you should choose to keep this privilege that you've got.